Hi, I'm Alan Page. I'm a tester at Microsoft on the Xbox team, and today I'm going to be talking about where testing ideas come from. This is a huge question. Where do these new ideas come from? Where can we find them? This is something that I've ranted about quite a bit. I've talked in my blog about, where is the forward thinking in software testing? Where do new test ideas come from, and where can we find them? When I look around the industry to see what other testers are talking about, sure, I see some good ideas, but then I see talk titles like these. All relevant topics for testers, things like model-based testing, test management, are all things that testers really need to learn. The problem with these particular talk titles is that they're all from a conference 12 years ago. And I want to know where are the new testing ideas. Now, to be clear, the world is not devoid of new testing ideas. There are new ideas in crowdsourcing. With UTest, there is ideas for learning, testers learning together in weekend testing. There's an open source testing platform. More and more tools are open source and available for all testers to not just use, but to build on and add on. And communities are growing for these things. So there are great new ideas happening in test. Even the test is dead meme that came up, I guess it started about a year ago at Eurostar, was a new idea in test. And despite the controversy over that whole idea, I believe that these new ideas are critical to the growth of testing. So if we talk about where new test ideas come from, probably the most important thing to remember is that test ideas are just ideas. So where do ideas come from? And I've done a lot of study and research, and one of the recent books that I've read that I've really liked on this subject, I'm going to talk about in the context of testing today, is Steven Johnson's book called Where Do New Testing Ideas Come From? Okay, now in that book, and probably in pretty much any article you read on innovation, they'll talk about that innovation or new testing ideas or new ideas aren't a light bulb moment. You don't, when Newton discovered calculus, he didn't say, I'm going to go discover calculus. He said, I'm going to go figure out why the Earth's orbit is elliptical and see if I can figure that out. And out of that came calculus. People took thousands or hundreds of thousands, likely even millions of baths before Archimedes took the one where he said, Eureka. So that idea it requires a lot of different things to happen. And those are some of the things that Steven Johnson goes over in this book. I want to talk about a few of his points from that book. He says new ideas come from these areas, the adjacent possible. And I'll go into each of these a little bit more in a minute. Liquid networks, the slow hunch, serendipity, error, excitation, and platforms. So let's talk about what those mean in Steven Johnson's context and also what that means to testers. The first concept is the adjacent possible. This is the premise that innovation happens when ideas serendipitously connect. Ideas hit each other. It's not just like one idea was great or one idea was bad, but when ideas combine is when great new ideas or innovation really happens. For example, several years ago at Microsoft, some of us came across this book called The Wisdom of Crowds, and it's pretty popular now. A lot of people know that crowds can be leveraged to do really great research or work. The power of the crowd is fantastic. If you combine that with the rise of the gamer score and gamification and people liking to get points and badges for what they do, here's two distinct ideas. Now let's combine them with a problem that as software testers we see all the time. Here's a localization problem. Localization testing is very difficult. You can see in this example, we've localized suspend and hibernate as the same word. So that's confusing until you get the help tip there, but it's wrong. How can we get these ideas to combine into something that can be a great idea? And some of you may have heard of this, but from this we built something we called the language quality game, where these ideas combined and we were able to make a game out of testing for localization. Now, one way I think where Microsoft's taking advantage of the crowd is our sheer size, and using our size as sort of a competitive advantage to giving this game to a lot of our subsidiaries who speak these languages, and they play this game in their discretionary time, and they help find localization bugs. In fact, over 4,000 people at Microsoft played this game. We found over 2,000 bugs, and all done in discretionary time, all bugs that were fixed in localization. So it's a great way to use the leverage of the crowd to tackle a hard problem using the motivation of gaming. Another thing talked about in this book is the liquid network, the idea that a network is what you need to make these ideas happen. These ideas, there's been studies in the past that show that ideas happen, or new ideas happen more often in an urban environment than a rural environment. And it's because these ideas can hit each other. If I'm living in a very small town and I want to have an insect collectors club, it may be kind of difficult to get enough people interested. If I'm in a city, I can find a large group, bounce ideas off each other, and do a lot more learning. At Microsoft, we have had a group now for about 11 years called the Test Architect Group, where some of us senior non-management testers get together and just talk about testing ideas. Through that network, a lot of great ideas have been born, and a lot of great solutions have come out of that. And we need to continue to grow these networks in order to get these ideas to collide and grow into new and great ideas that can actually take our careers and discipline and art form of software testing forward. Another idea from this book is the slow hunch. And this is the idea that sometimes you just have an idea that may not be ready for prime time yet. It's the idea that you need to think about and stew over and whittle on and delve into something that ends up being great or not. Or maybe that turns into an idea that bounces off another idea. The canonical example of this is the World Wide Web. When Tim Berners-Lee first had the idea of using hypertext to link sites together, it was 10 years before there was a usable web out there. He burned and burned on this idea for a long time. And we see ideas come along in other industries, but not as much in test. But here's where I think maybe there's a bright spot in that up until today, people have not stayed in testing for a long time. It's been, in many cases, sort of a transitory role. People did it for a while, may move into a programming role or into something else. I'm starting to see testers stay in test a lot longer. And through that, I think we'll get these ideas, these slow hunch ideas that we haven't seen a lot of in test, to start to come to fruition. And I'm really excited about that. And there's serendipity, the accidental connection. And I love this. I love that your chocolate and my peanut butter, your peanut butter and my chocolate is something that happens in the world of innovation and new ideas all the time. Tons of examples of this. Two from 3M, Scotchgard and Post-it notes are great examples of serendipity. The microwave oven, the idea for cooking with radar waves didn't actually happen until years later when the inventor noticed that the radio waves melted a candy bar in his pocket. Penicillin, all these things, examples of accidental discovery of new ideas. So one thing we can do in our world is just be aware and be observational of what kinds of things are happening so we can see these connections happen and see what kinds of things go on. There's I did another post recently called Learning is Dead, and where I was worried that with this internet age that learning wasn't happening, and then as I dug deeper that these serendipitous connections weren't happening. There's an argument that says that people don't walk into libraries and browse the stacks anymore and grab a book off the shelf just because the cover or the title looks really cool. We don't do that anymore. And people worry that because we don't do that, we don't make those connections that we wouldn't make by accident otherwise. While that's true to some extent, I don't know about you, but I find myself doing some of the same things in our connected world today. I didn't find out there's a name for it till recently, but you can do Wikipedia tunneling, I think it's called, where you can where one moment you start looking up to see what song the Boomtown Rats sang in 1980, and a half hour later you have 30 tabs open and you're browsing something about the Grand Canyon, just kind of cruising through information, this discovery. And through this, these serendipitous connections can happen. So this seeking mind is really important for this to happen and for these new ideas to come into test. And then there's error, failure, And this gets talked about in all of the text innovation, you know, fail fast and you learn from your failures. And there's quotes that say that invention is just the accumulation of error. And all these things are true. And what this means in testing is we need to experiment. We need to not be afraid to fail. We need to be able to have ideas that may sound wrong. I have a expression I used at work called a yawapa. And a yawapa is yet another wild-ass proposal from Alan. And I throw these out all the time. And some of these are great and many are not. Actually, I would say that most are not. But what I hope is by throwing these ideas out, not being afraid to fail, that these ideas can combine with the ideas of others and grow into ideas that we can use and really help us advance what we're doing. And then there's exaptation. Exaptation is a term that comes from biology. It's a trait or behavior made for one function that is adapted into another. The example used in the book and that I found in reading on the web is it's that feathers were originally created for warmth, but they turned into something that could be used for flight. Now, if we take exaptation and move it to a technology point of view, it's borrowing a mature technology from a different field and putting it to work on an unrelated problem, or from a different area, or for just using something that's working for not what it was used for. And we all have these ideas. I would argue that Excel was made for crunching numbers, but it really makes a nice little lightweight database application. Probably not the best example, but you get the idea. One example from Microsoft is a traditional problem of how do we optimize application performance. And there's a lot of different ways to do this, but the example that came out of Microsoft Research, or the practice and the tools that came out of Microsoft Research, were to take a program, break it into all the basic blocks that make up that program, and then run your mainline scenarios, the scenarios you think customers are most likely to use, because those are the ones where you really want your performance to be quick. And then measure which blocks of code were hit in those scenarios. And then what this tool set would do would be to rearrange those binaries, rearrange those blocks in that binary into an order. And so disk reads would be sequential, much faster, less likely chance of that code getting paged out. So performance overall, and this is measurable, was significantly faster. You'll also notice that some blocks are missing off the bottom, because another part of that tool was to, if a block in two different functions was the exact same code, it would just use the same one and do all the right reordering. Pretty sophisticated tool set, worked very well for that, still in use across large parts of Microsoft today. Great tool, talking about exaptation. This also was the basis for how we measure code coverage at Microsoft, because we know which blocks of code get hit by any particular action or test. Now we also know which blocks of code are hit, and it's a nice sophisticated way for us to measure code coverage across all different kinds of binaries. So we took a tool that was working very well for its purpose and used it for I wouldn't say completely different, but quite a bit different purpose, and had great success with it. And then finally, the last thing that Stephen Johnson mentions is platforms. And here's what we'll ask about, this isn't Sputnik, but what do Sputnik and Facebook have in common? And the story from his book, which I'll repeat, is in a much shorter form, is when Sputnik launched, there were a couple of researchers that wanted to find out, I wonder if we can figure out from the radio waves, broadcast waves, where Sputnik is. And they got their radios out and they listened and they were able to find the sound it was making, and then using the Doppler effect, kind of plot its course. And they plotted the orbit of Sputnik for several days. This was all in their spare time. Later on, somebody asked them, hey, this is really cool. Could you do the reverse? Could you make it so we can track things on the ground from where something is in the sky? They said, well, give us a minute. We'll figure that out. So they went and they did some calculations, and they came back and they said, yeah, it's actually easier to do that. And I said, great, because we have this problem that we have these submarines with nuclear missiles on them, and we don't know how to aim them. And if we could have some satellites maybe help us, that would be great. And all this is, so a little bit of exaptation there in a strange form. But what happened from that is they built the platform for GPS. When Ronald Reagan opened up GPS as a platform in, must have been the 80s, then all of a sudden, the smartphone in my pocket and the smartphone you're probably looking at right now, it knows where you are. Your car knows where you are. This open platform of GPS has enabled a lot of new ideas and innovation to happen. And really, if you look at the success of something like Facebook, sure, it's a social part of it, and that's probably where a lot of the success came from, but it's a platform you can build on. Your iPhone is a platform, the marketplace you can build on. Your Windows smartphone is a platform that you can build on. These platforms and taking sort of some of the basic hard part out is where a lot of new ideas come from. So those platforms are really important. So let's revisit again, kind of where do testing ideas come from? Where do they come from? And I think one thing to remember is they come from your network. You need to have a network. You can't just sit in a cave and come up with new ideas. You need ideas come from other ideas. You need your ideas to bounce off someone else. The larger your network, the larger your collider where you can collide these ideas, the better chance you as a tester have of coming up with a new and great idea. And fortunately, plenty of ways for you to grow your network. There's a huge community of testers on Twitter. There's conferences, a great place, not just for the talks, and I picked on talks a little bit earlier, but remember that ideas come from ideas. So even if you're seeing someone talk about the same automation subject that somebody else talked about 10 years ago, there will be nuggets in there, maybe the whole presentation or parts of it that you will find a way to combine with your ideas and come up with maybe something great. There are forums and user groups. We have 3 different local user groups in the Seattle area where I live around software testing. And there's things like Weekend Testers and Weekend Testers America where you can work and learn with other testers and find a way to collide these ideas. And there's more. And there's dialogue and discussion, conflict and learning. And what I mean by that is there's this concept of brainstorming where every idea is a good one and you don't dismiss anything, which I think is pretty good. It's good for a nice world. But in my experience, great ideas come when there's healthy conflict. Healthy conflict that avoids the personal attacks. But if you give me an idea and I don't like it, I'm going to tell you I don't like it. I'm going to tell you why. And that, in my experience, and both in participating and observing, spurs the conversation and the collision of ideas that helps get even better ideas to come to fruition. So don't be afraid of that. And don't be afraid of learning. That's, I think, again, I'll say one more time, ideas come from collision of other ideas. So you need to make those things happen. Ideas are what's important to make new ideas. In this book, Stephen Johnson has this quote, which I love: "Chance favors the connected mind." And these serendipitous connections, these ideas, come from having a mind connected and being able to, discover things. The seeking mind I've talked about, it's trying to discover what you don't know, and using that to combine with what you do know, and hopefully stirring that pot up and coming up with something new or something to experiment and try. So where do testing ideas come from? This is a long one, and I'm going to read this slide. Testing ideas come from people like you, testers who build and use their network to seek out new ideas, adapt existing ideas, and solve hard problems through their experiences, discussions, mistakes, and observation. Now that's a long one. It won't fit on a bumper sticker, so let me see if I can put this as succinctly as possible. If you want to know where new testing ideas come from, the new test ideas come from you. You, the testers with the seeking minds that are growing and advancing the profession. The new test ideas, I'm confident, will come from you. So go out there, experiment, play, fail, learn, and come up with new testing ideas that are going to help you and our profession. Here's some of the books where I got some of the research for this presentation. If you have any questions, now's the time.